Robert Burns comes from.
Yes. Yeah.
But my family come from near here.
I visited I visited Scotland once. I went to the Antonine Wall, as you can imagine.
And a field trip.
A field trip. Yeah.
I don't think it's as impressive as Hadrian's Wall.
Yes.
It was kind of temporary, but that's awesome. Like, I keep thinking if I stumble occasionally I find more references to Antoninus, and I keep thinking I should forward them to you.
Oh yeah, but, please.
There's the occasional little bits and pieces that crop up.
Please do. So too, I think students are still joining us, and I know that you're on using your data, which I felt so bad about.
Oh no, that's okay. It's not like it's not expensive, but I should say I think it seems okay at the moment. But occasionally, if a cow walks past or something and blocks the signal, like it will suddenly cut out. So it seems pretty good at the moment. But just if the signal suddenly drops out, don't be too surprised. That happens occasionally.
Right. Well, thank you, Donald Robertson, so much for coming so late at night. And everyone knows that my journey with Stoicism really began with your book, which we've been reading in this class. And it's amazing that every reading, I actually learn so much more. It's like I keep unpacking, the meditations and your book. And it's just been incredible. Donald's other books, Stoicism in the Heart of Happiness, and the Stoic Philosophy and Rational Cognitive Psychotherapy. And you have Verissimus coming out, and this June, I think, and the biography, right, of Marcus Aurelius.
And a biography of Marcus Aurelius that I don't know exactly when that's coming out. It might be next spring, actually. For Yale University Press.
Yes. So.
And also, there's a book that's an academic anthology edited by John Sick, Cambridge Companion to Marcus Aurelius and the Meditations, and I've got a chapter in that about Marcus Aurelius and psychotherapy. So I've written a lot. One of the things that happens sometimes when you write a book and it kind of sells a few copies is that the publishers, that people want you to keep writing about the same subject.
Yes.
You kind of get typecast as a writer a bit, but actually very soon I've sort of started writing a book about Socrates, so hopefully I can kind of shift onto writing more about Socrates for a change. I love writing about Marcus Aurelius, but I've done so much about him now that I think it's time to move on to something slightly different.
The 5 books, I think you'll have 5 books on Marcus Aurelius, but and then Socrates, the grandfather of Stoicism. So
yeah, I find Socrates are more. I kind of like them. I suppose they're my 2 favorite philosophers, but Marcus Aurelius is definitely, much as I love him, kind of more of a one-dimensional character. The Socrates is so much more of a kind of layers of an onion. He's so much more of a complex, ironic, multifaceted, ambiguous character. And I think he even more than Marcus Aurelius is someone that you can go back to repeatedly over many decades and see different things, different aspects. I think that's partly because of the way he comes down to us through these dialogues that focus on his questioning method. Whereas Stoicism, in a way, someone once asked me about this, and just out of the blue, I suddenly thought, well, Stoicism is kind of like the bullet point version of what Socrates was teaching. And I suppose that's what many scholars would say, that the Stoics, Socrates hints at certain moral and psychological ideas through the method of questioning. He has an agenda, he has a positive philosophy, but it's often kind of implied. It's often pretty clear what he's implying. With the Stoics, it's stated much more directly and explicitly, and they're more concerned about how do you actually put this into practice. Although, you know, we only have a tiny fraction of Stoic texts surviving. So maybe if we could get in a time machine and go back, we'd get a big shock, and we'd discover that the Stoic texts that were actually in circulation maybe had a kind of different feel to the ones that survive. I think, and I hate to say this, but I think that there's a little bit of evidence that points towards this, that the Stoic texts that we have surviving may have survived in part because they were the best ones or the most interesting ones. And some of the fragments that we have from some of the other Stoic texts are much drier. They're kind of more academic. We have the Compendium of Greek Theology by Cornutus, for example, which nobody reads because it's like, unless they're a total kind of geek about Greek mythology, because it's pretty dry. And we have the ethical fragments of Hierocles, who's kind of almost a contemporary of Marcus Aurelius. Not many people read that. It's kind of interesting, but it's pretty dry as well. So maybe we have this tiny fraction of Stoic text surviving, but maybe it's the best, like 1% that come down to us.
Yeah, and it's, you know, and you sort of mentioned that it is almost, it's amazing that Marcus Aurelius's meditation survived, and that we have it. You know, there's just this one book.
It's, in a sense, I'm stretching things a little bit by saying this, but you could say it's the last book ever written on Stoicism in antiquity. It's the last surviving book. And Marcus Aurelius is virtually the last Stoic of whom we hear in antiquity, and almost 500 years after Zeno founded Stoicism. So the Stoic school was around for a really long time. You know, to Marcus Aurelius, Zeno of Citium, the founder of Stoicism, would be like a kind of late medieval figure to us. It was 5 centuries earlier, and he's still talking about this. But even though all the evidence suggests that Marcus Aurelius was contrary to what some people have claimed, incidentally, but they're wrong. Like, the evidence, I think, clearly suggests that Marcus Aurelius was famous for being a Stoic philosopher. And in fact, that Stoicism, unsurprisingly, kind of became trendy. Philosophy in general became trendy during the reign of Marcus Aurelius, obviously, because this is what the emperor's into. So, you know, people tend to get into that. And yet, nevertheless, we hear almost nothing. I think there's 1 or 2 very fleeting references to Stoicism, to Stoics after the time of Marcus Aurelius. It's very surprising that it ends with this big bang, like the most famous Stoic of all, and then virtually nothing afterwards.
Right, yeah. When did you actually come up with the idea of how to think like a Roman emperor? Because it's to me, it's really interesting how you draw from the meditations, and you sort of, we connect to the philosophy, but also Marcus the man, in the way you.
I came up with the title I think it was about 20 years ago, because I was invited to give a corporate stress management seminar for Shell in London. I did a couple actually, and I thought, how am I going to make Stoicism seem less interesting, and it's more interesting, less academic to these guys? How am I going to make it kind of seem engaging to these guys who were like stock traders and stuff? And so I called it How to Think Like a Roman Emperor. Like, that kind of name popped into my head. And then I proposed, here's a bit of trivia for you, a bit in relation to books and stuff, incidentally. Like, the very first book I ever proposed to write, that book, The Philosophy of Cognitive-Behavioural Therapy, the proposal that I sent to the publisher was for a book called How to Think Like a Roman Emperor. And they rejected it because they didn't like the title. And so I changed the title and just tweaked the proposal a little bit and sent it back, and they accepted it. But I disagreed with them, and I thought it was a good title. But so I just kind of sat on it for 15 years or something, I think. And then I got another opportunity, and I thought, I still think that's a good title, even though it was rejected by another publisher. So eventually, that's where the concept, the title came from. Incidentally, today it's been translated into 19 languages. And today, I just saw today the cover design for the Arabic translation of How to Think Like a Roman Emperor. So one of the things I'm most pleased about is that it's kind of reached this quite a big international audience for a book on a modern book on Stoicism. And the concept of the book, it's interesting because my publisher said to me, could you write an introductory book on Stoicism? And I said, sure, but I've already written one called Stoicism and the Art of Happiness. And also loads of people are writing introductory books on Stoicism. Like, they're really good, like Massimo Paolucci and Chuck Chakapani and like Ryan Holiday, like loads of other people have written books about Stoicism. So I thought, but when I encounter something like that, to myself, is there a way of answering yes and no to this? Is there a way that I can do it without doing it? You know, is there a kind of roundabout, a paradoxical way of doing it? So I thought, can I write an introductory book in Stoicism that's different from all the other introductory books in Stoicism? And I thought, geez, like, how would I do that? And I thought, well, how did the ancient Stoics teach Stoicism? And I thought, you know, the funny thing is they're pretty explicit in saying that books and lectures are an inferior way to learn the philosophy, although that's what we have from them. And the much better is the experience of encountering role models, like living examples. And that's why the Stoics talk a lot about people that exemplify virtues. And Marcus Aurelius spends the entire first chapter of the Meditations thinking of role models, his family and tutors that exemplify Stoic virtues. So I thought, okay, well, then I'll focus on a role model. And at first I thought, well, let's write about Zeno. And I thought there's some good anecdotes about him, but there isn't really enough to fill a whole book. I thought, geez, if only there were a Stoic that we knew a lot more about. I thought, well, instead of the last Stoic, like the first Stoic rather, like, you know, maybe I need to look at the last Stoic. Because actually some people assume we don't know that much about Marcus Aurelius, but these are in the category of people on the internet that say stuff that's the opposite of the truth. Like, you know, you find people saying a lot of things that bear no resemblance to reality. We know loads about Marcus Aurelius, of course, because he was a Roman emperor. And so we have the Meditations, which contains a certain amount of biographical information, particularly in the first chapter, and it's his own private thoughts. We have a cache of his private letters, which is an extraordinary thing to have from a Roman emperor. We get to see his private life very directly and uncensored. We also, not a lot of people know this, have a pretty extensive record of his legal rescripts. So we know about his legislative agenda. We also have reference, we have about 3 major Roman histories of his reign. And we have, you know, a bunch of references to him in other contemporary and later authors as well. And then we have numismatic and archaeological evidence. We have inscriptions and stuff. So, for example, we know that he was in Carnuntum in Austria in 171 AD precisely. How do we know that? Because there's a gravestone of a Praetorian guard with the year marked on it at Carnuntum, and the Praetorian guard normally accompanied the emperor. So we've got pretty good evidence there that the emperor was in Carnuntum specifically in that year. So we have a bunch of way more, we possibly have more evidence about the life of Marcus Aurelius and his character than we do for any other ancient philosopher. And certainly we have way more material about him than we do about any other Stoic. So I thought that kind of made it obvious that I should use Marcus Aurelius as an example. And the other reason was that my daughter, who was around about, I guess at that time she was about 6 years old, I used to tell her lots of stories about Greek mythology. And she kept asking me for more. So, you know, at night after she went to bed, I was reading more books on Greek mythology. I thought I've run out of Stoa. I have to kind of go and learn some more. And then I started telling her anecdotes about Socrates and Diogenes the Cynic. And she wasn't actually that interested in Marcus Aurelius. She loves Diogenes the Cynic, I think because she actually thought he was a dog. She was quite disappointed to find that he wasn't literally a dog. But she liked these stories about Diogenes the Cynic. And I thought, well, if my little girl can understand, you know, I thought, how can we kind of make a Stoicism more accessible to a wider audience? And I thought the way to do it is through anecdotes and stories. Now, if my little girl can kind of understand these ideas and engage with them in these form of these anecdotes, then surely anybody can. And I also thought, in the ancient world, like today, philosophy is taught through lectures, seminars. We're familiar with essays, maybe even philosophical dialogues to some extent, people are familiar with. But what's less well known is that in antiquity, philosophy was passed on to a large extent through anecdotes and even satirical plays, which we don't normally think of as a repository of philosophy. And actually, much of the information that we have, most of the information we have about Diogenes the Cynic, like in fact, like virtually all of the information we have about Diogenes the Cynic comes from these quirky little anecdotes, and many of those come from satirical plays about him. So in the ancient world, it was more common to pass on philosophy through stories, and then that's kind of disappeared to some extent. So I thought I'm part of kind of going back to this earlier tradition in some ways. And I would have made that whole book mainly stories, but my publisher wanted me to put more stuff about CBT in it. And I know also I never wrote the introduction. Originally, my publisher asked me to add an introduction that talks a little bit more about how I became interested in Stoicism myself. So that's how that book evolved.
Yeah, no, it's been exciting to actually see. I've seen many of the covers. I saw the Japanese cover, which is it's neat. I mean, really nice. I mean, really, you've had some wonderful covers in different languages. And it's neat that this philosophy is actually, which has tools, which really feels like a therapy for the soul, is actually reaching, an audience. Just before you arrived, I was talking to Luke, and I said, yeah, when I wake up and I'm anxious and I can't go back to sleep, I play out the premeditation of adversity, like they're actual tools, or when I'm angry. But to actually have access to all of this, not in a dry way, which is like an academic text, but really in a very lived experience. And so, how do we deal with anger? I mean, we can see so much of that, everywhere, as we've seen demonstrated.
I think
at the Oscars,
on television recently.
Yes.
Yeah, but also just every day on the internet and in politics and stuff every day. You see people. And in fact, the more we learn about anger and the more we think about it, I think the more we can actually spot it influencing things in kind of subtle ways. And the Stoics thought that anger was, I think one way of portraying, one thing you could say about Stoicism, like sometimes often people approach Stoicism from the kind of the same perspective, and there are a number of other perspectives we could adopt on it. One of them is that the Stoics seem to me to really want us to view anger as being one of the main emotional problem that we should be focusing on. And conversely, they think that cultivating natural affection or philostorgia is one of the main healthy emotions that we should cultivate. It's the opposite of anger in a sense. So yeah, absolutely. A very practical thing every day, anger, also anxiety. My wife, I got married recently. My wife,
congratulations, yes. To Cassie.
My wife also writes about Stoicism, and she was just talking to somebody who's having a medical procedure in another country, and they kind of wanted Stoic advice about how to cope with their anxiety, with their worry about that. So every day, we hear from people who are using Stoicism to cope with all sorts of, problems of living.
And I think one of the things about Marcus that is especially appealing is also that he occupied a leadership role. He was a leader, and it really gives you what a good leader is. And he models that, which is, I think really.
He's a weirdly reluctant leader.
What?
Yeah, he was kind of a reluctant leader in some ways.
Yes.
But sometimes those are the best leaders. he actually, Socrates thought that we should be wary. I mean, one of the main lessons of Plato's Republic is that Socrates thinks that we should be wary about people who want to be political leaders. And he thinks it's like the better people are the people that are kind of reluctant to get into politics. So Marcus, originally, from what we know, he didn't really want to become an emperor. I think that's partly, I'm going to say something a bit controversial. I don't think this is controversial, but I know a lot of people seem to disagree with this. I really think Hadrian, contrary to the way that he's often portrayed, is being kind of one of the better. In many ways, Hadrian was one of the better emperors. He did a lot of good things. There's no denying that. But towards the end of his life, he went bonkers and engaged in various political purges and became quite a tyrannical and menacing figure. And that was the Hadrian that Marcus Aurelius knew. I saw somebody going off on the internet recently about how Marcus Aurelius barely knew Hadrian, and that's also not historically true, right? Marcus was related to Hadrian. Hadrian took an interest in Marcus from early in his life. Hadrian was away from Rome a lot, but he was definitely very interested and very involved in Marcus's upbringing. And when Hadrian came back to Rome, he ordered Marcus to come and live in his villa for the last 6 months or so of his life. So Marcus actually lived with Hadrian during his final stage, his decline, when he was supposedly suicidal and going pretty crazy and in a terrible physical and mental state. And what Marcus saw there, I just think is almost inconceivable. It would be, in some ways what it reminds me of is the movie Citizen Kane, and Charles Foster Kane kind of locking himself up in this palace of Xanadu and becoming very isolated and stuff. I think Hadrian is a little bit like that. And Marcus was kind of dragged into this. No wonder he was reluctant, because it must have been really scary for him. Hadrian was obsessed with the idea that people were trying to assassinate him and stuff. And when you're like a teenager and you're caught in the middle of that, you're next in the firing line. Like, if Hadrian changes his mind about it, then you're probably going to be executed, or maybe someone that's out to get Hadrian would get you. So I can't imagine, it must have been an extraordinary, unsettling, like chaotic experience for Marcus. It's no surprise that he then found an incredibly messy situation to get dragged into. And I think the reason he changed his mind about that was because of Antoninus Pius. The Marcus wasn't old enough to become emperor, arguably, and certainly Hadrian doesn't seem to have thought so. Hadrian, I think, wanted Marcus to be emperor, but thought he needed to appoint Antoninus as an interim ruler. And I think Marcus thought Antoninus was everything that Hadrian wasn't. He was the complete opposite of him, and he inspired him to think maybe it is possible to rule in a healthy, rational, benevolent way, and not in this kind of chaotic, sort of tyrannical like mode that he saw in Hadrian. So yeah, I think there's a lot of this. Also kind of highlights the fact, I think, that Marcus's story is difficult to understand. It's incomplete unless we also know quite a lot about some of the people around him, particularly Antoninus and Hadrian and other important, because they shape the whole environment in which he was brought up, and he's kind of reacting to them in some ways.
Yeah, well, I'm looking forward to reading your biography, and I'm going to open it up